Hello class, welcome to our video for Module 5, Civil Rights in America. This module is relatively long. I believe it's about the longest one we have. There's lots of information packed into it. And so we will have at least 2 videos. We may have 3 because I can only record them in 15-minute increments. Also, just a note, I have left more text in the outline than I usually do. Usually I leave room for you to fill in the information so you can put it into your own words. Since much of this information is not in your textbook, because I wanted it to be updated to incorporate the contemporary civil rights movement, then because of that, I left a lot of the actual information in the outline. But I encourage you to look over this outline and maybe rewrite some of the information as you listen to the video just to make sure you're clear. And even though this is a lot of information, I've tried to kind of point out some similarities and some parallels between the classic and the contemporary civil rights movements to give you kind of a sense of the big picture. So just to get started, as far as defining civil rights, we define it as basic entitlements to be free from unequal treatment, and special characteristics are deemed important when we're making a case for civil rights violation, and those special characteristics include race, gender, and disability. Those are relatively narrow categories, so as we will find when we talk about gender and or LGBTQ discrimination, it is not included as one of the special characteristics, and therefore it does leave LGBTQ people vulnerable. So just to provide an overview of the civil rights movements, the first that we'll talk about is the classic civil rights movement, and then we'll go on to talk about the contemporary civil rights movement. So as far as the classic movement goes, it was an organized effort by African Americans to end racial discrimination and gain equal rights under the law. Now there are a couple of key goals that the movement was striving for, and also a few important outcomes that were arrived at. So, important goals: end racial segregation, secure legal recognition and federal protection under the law per the Constitution, and one of the key outcomes is that it created the conditions for a more broad-based and comprehensive democracy. It laid a foundation also upon which other civil rights movements or other organizations could be influenced and pursued civil rights for various groups. Let's see. As far as organizations that were involved in the civil rights movement, it's impossible to list them all. So I just have an overview of some of the key organizations that you should be familiar with, just to have an understanding of the multiple organizations that were involved. Also, as far as key events go, this is a timeline that I've put in place for you. It does not by any means cover all of the important events that happened during the civil rights movement, but sometimes we hear about events as though they were happening in a vacuum, and so I wanted to put some of the key events into a context or a timeline for you so you could get a sense of how so many things were happening kind of at once. So I'm not going to read the timeline, the entire thing, but I'll just point out that it's starting with 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education, which ends segregation in public schools. But even though we might think of that as the end of the civil rights movement, you should understand that there was a lot of work that went into getting us to that point, and there was a lot of work and many sacrifices were made after that. It ends in 1964, 1965 with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And so as you will learn, even though Brown versus Board of Education was here and it ended segregation in public schools, there was still so much work to be done, because ending segregation in name is different from ending it in practice, and also ending discrimination in name was different from ending it in practice. So hopefully this timeline can be useful for you. I mentioned that the contemporary civil rights movement laid a foundation for other organizations to pursue their rights. One organization that was influenced by the classic civil rights movement is the National Farm Workers Association, co-founded by Cesar Chavez here and Dolores Huerta here in 1962. This quote is just meant to give you an idea of the connection that Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Martin Luther King Jr., and others saw between the work of the civil rights movement and the work of the farm workers. So so hopefully this sheds some light on how they saw the integration or the connection between the civil rights movement and other movements. So this is just another a piece of information for you to read and be familiar with, and possibly use it to kind of illustrate your understanding of the connection and the organizations that were influenced. This second point is also another, it offers the same idea as far as giving you a quote. And this quote is offered by, this is part B, but it's the same quote. It's offered by Scott Nakagawa, who is a partner with the Change Lab. And basically, he is reflecting on the influence of the civil rights movement to Asian American civil rights actions. So again, this is a quote from him, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to use it as evidence to illustrate the connection and the foundation that the civil rights movement laid for other civil rights actions. Now, you have a film entitled 13th on your syllabus. There is a link to the film in Canvas. So when you're watching the film, I wanted to make sure that there were some key concepts that you don't miss. I know that you can get lost when you're watching a film if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. So the name of the film is entitled After the 13th Amendment. So it's important to understand what the 13th Amendment did. It abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment as a crime, punishment for a crime. So that loophole is what really created an opportunity for the focus of the film, which is mass incarceration. So when you're watching the film, though, one thing that you should seek to understand is what is mass incarceration and what is the impact of mass incarceration. Also, you need to be able to articulate why the film is entitled 13th. Finally, or not finally, but what's the concept of criminalization and why is it important? All of these questions are interconnected, so you should be able to go from one to the other to the other. But so when you are when you're practicing, you should try writing out and articulating why the film is entitled 13th. And then you should also consider what this concept of criminalization is, practice articulating it, writing it out a little bit. How would you define it? And why is it important to the film? How does it tie in? Point E, how does the film help illustrate the link between criminalization of black men and mass incarceration? So you build from your general knowledge and discussion of criminalization to the specific link between criminalization of black men and mass incarceration. So this process of criminalization is important for you to understand, and I want you to demonstrate that you do understand it and that you can talk about it generally and specifically. Next, the prison industrial complex is another key concept that is discussed throughout the film, but it's important for you to be able to identify what it is and articulate why it's important and how it developed. And as far as the prison industrial complex goes, one thing that I will point out is that I want you to understand that there are multiple factors that are involved in creating this criminalization, this prison industrial complex. So when you think about prisons, when you just think about the economy of prisons, who makes money from them, and who is kind of fueling the rise of prisons, who are the folks who are being criminalized so that they can be considered as criminals and then be legitimately put into prisons. I want you to try and develop a big picture view of how these different systems operate. The criminal justice system, the fact that there are prisons that are private that are making money off of people being put in jail, and then this loophole that exists in the 13th Amendment. So all of these concepts are important, and you should be able to kind of speak to how they fit together. All right, let's see. As far as the relevance of the civil rights movement, keep in mind when you hear or watch the film and you hear the folks in the film talk about the civil rights movement and some of the gains that were made, they kind of paint a picture and give you a timeline of what was happening and what policy decisions were being made. So consider the gains that were being made throughout the civil rights movement, the classic civil rights movement that is, and consider the development of this Southern strategy, which was a process that was used to recruit rural, poor Southern people who identified as white into conservative politics, and pay attention to what is called the backlash against the classic civil rights movement, which kind of allowed for this kind of all of these forces to come together and lead to this explosion in our prison system. Finally, another key concept for you to pay attention to, make sure you understand, is this idea of crimigation. So understand that that is a connection, it's a made up word, but it's joining immigration and criminalization. And basically it points towards what we're seeing now with criminalization. That same process that happened to criminalize black men is also being used to criminalize immigrants. So it's a process, a socially constructed process. So again, we're referring to our key concepts here. Understand how social constructions work to allow our society to create our idea of what a criminal is. And then therefore understand that creating that idea of criminal opens the door to heap on punishments on those folks that we determine are criminals. But also understand that the process of social constructions, as we talked about earlier, is not it does not happen in a vacuum, and it doesn't just happen kind of naturally in nature. These are our interpretations, our values, and our standards that we use to create this idea of what a criminal is. The same way we use them to create an idea of what race is or an idea of what ability is. So apply that concept of social constructions and the social construction of reality, apply it to this idea of crimigation. So we're going to move into part 2. I'm going to stop the video here, and you can look out for part 2 of Module 5, Civil Rights in America.